The Cultural Revolution. After the economic disaster of the Great Leap Forward, communist leader Mao Zedong tried to reassert his authority and purge the country of capitalist elements. Not only did it throw China into decades of violence and chaos, but as Frank Dikötter says, it was a massive failure. Hello, this is Big Ideas. I'm Paul Barclay. Frank Dikötter is the Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. Prior to that, he was Professor of the Modern History of China at the University of London. For his latest book, The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, 1962 to 1976, Frank Dikötter has been researching numerous archives in China and putting together a history and, more importantly, an analysis of the Cultural Revolution. He shows that ordinary people used the political chaos of the Cultural Revolution to resurrect the market and hollow out the party's ideology, casting the era in a whole new light. We start with Frank Dikötter reminding us about the main stages of the Cultural Revolution.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Let me spend about 5-6 minutes on what I believe Chairman Mao had in mind, what the meaning of the Cultural Revolution is. There are about 3. And let me then take you chronologically through this decade from 1966 to 76. It seems rather chaotic, but in fact there are periods which are very, very different, that contrast to each other. The red years from 66 to 68, when Mao literally encourages the population to criticize party members. The black years from 1968 to 71 are, in a nutshell, an attempt by the army to turn this country into a military garrison. And I'm very briefly at the end, I'll talk about the grey years. You'll find out there's actually something there to be redeemed in that Cultural Revolution. But let me start with an anecdote. When the chairman himself receives a group of guerrilla fighters from Africa in the summer of 1963, there is a young visitor from southern Rhodesia, tall, square-shouldered, and he has a question for the chairman. He says, "Chairman, there used to be a red star shining bright over the Kremlin, but that star has slipped away. The Soviets used to help us. Now they're selling weapons to our enemies." So my question to you is the following: will the red star over Tiananmen Square also vanish? The chairman listens, puffs on a cigarette pensively, and says, "I understand your question. You are saying that the Soviet Union has betrayed the revolution. You're asking me if I can guarantee to you that China will not betray the revolution too." At this point in time, we're still thinking about finding a way to prevent this country from becoming revisionist like the Soviet Union. 3 years later, the People's Daily publishes an incendiary editorial called "Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons." The population is told that apparently revisionists, counter-revolutionaries have wormed their way into the party, the government, the army. A new revolution is required to flush out all these enemies of the revolution. And if this weren't enough excitement, it comes to light that 4 of the top leaders have been placed under arrest in Beijing, accused of plotting against the chairman himself. One of them is the mayor of Beijing, accused of having tried to turn the capital into a citadel of revisionism. Sure, many people are slightly taken aback and surprised. How could there be so many counter-revolutionaries after some 15, 16 years of revolution? But all of them know that the number 1 representative of revisionism is the Soviet leader and party secretary Nikita Khrushchev. He's been denounced endlessly since 1956 when, in a secret speech that pretty much shook the socialist camp to its core, he denounced his erstwhile master Joseph Stalin, detailing the horror of his reign and denouncing the cult of personality. Mao, of course, felt personally attacked by de-Stalinization. He, after all, was the Stalin of the People's Republic of China. But he must have thought, how could one man, Nikita Khrushchev, single-handedly engineer a complete reversal of policy in the mighty Soviet Union? How's it possible? Well, I think he believed the answer was in culture. In 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin had, of course, confiscated the assets of the capitalists. But capitalist culture managed to survive. So what Mao proposed was nothing short of a cultural revolution. Eliminate feudal, bourgeois, superstitious, capitalist culture. It is that culture that allowed a few people to somehow erode and subvert the entire system from the top down. But of course, it wasn't just a theory about the Cultural Revolution. There was also a strategy at work here. Mao was very much concerned about his own legacy. Stalin had been denounced. What would happen to him? Already in 1956, there were those who used Khrushchev's speech to criticize the cult of personality. Of course, when Stalin died in 1953, Mao thought that he would become the leader of the socialist camp. So the chairman is thinking about his legacy. What is he going to leave behind? His very first attempt to steal the thunder of the Soviet Union and leave Nikita Khrushchev behind in the dust was the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, when people in the countryside were herded into giant people's communes by transforming every man, every woman in the countryside into a foot soldier in a giant army to be deployed and work day and night. Mao thought he would be able to transform the economy, catapult China past the Soviet Union, making him the Messiah, leading humanity into a world of plenty for all. But of course, it backfired rather badly. The Great Leap Forward didn't lead to plenty for all, but to the starving of tens of millions of people. So the Cultural Revolution, to some extent, is Mao's second attempt to somehow become the pivot around which the socialist universe revolved. Great Leap Forward, massive disaster. Here comes the Cultural Revolution. The theory is that Lenin, with 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution, opened the first stage of the world revolution. Now Mao would have the second stage with the Cultural Revolution. He would be the one to inherit, defend, develop Marxism, Leninism into something new. Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. A grandiose vision, of course. But then something else was at work too. Mao used the Cultural Revolution to get rid of his critics. He noticed Stalin had failed to spot Khrushchev as a potential traitor. So no point in having a list of people to be eliminated. Have a massive purge of everybody in any position of power. So to some extent, the Cultural Revolution is also an attempt to make sure that no one will ever be in a position to criticize the chairman himself. And of course there are critics. In 1956, there are those who criticize the cult of personality and delete Mao Zedong thought from the party constitution at the end of the year. But surely his star is at its lowest in 1962, as some 7,000 party members convene in Beijing to discuss the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. All sorts of rumors are going around in the corridors of power. Allegations that the chairman is innumerate, potentially dangerous, that he really ought to take responsibility for that disaster that just happened. From here onwards, 1962, Mao starts plotting his way towards the Cultural Revolution. I call this the early years, 1962-66. And it is, in a nutshell, a pre-cultural revolution under the banner of the so-called Socialist Education Campaign. All of it in capital letters. It's a campaign that will last 4 years and is an attempt to make sure that the very people in the countryside are told about the benefits of socialism, Socialist Education Campaign. The ones who just went through the horrors of starvation with the Great Leap Forward. Liu Shaoqi, number 2, takes charge of the Socialist Education Campaign and decides that about 1/3 of the countryside is in the hands of class enemies. He purges some 5 million party members. Extraordinary. But something else is of concern to the chairman, namely young people in the cities, heirs to the revolution. They are schooled at every level in class hatred. Lin Biao, the man in charge of the army, promotes a martial atmosphere, distributes the Little Red Book, help train ordinary students in using guns. In primary school, some children use air guns to shoot at targets of so-called class enemies. At every level, children are taken to museums where the horrors of capitalism are exposed to them. All of them, these students, are itching to find a real class enemy. So when after years of indoctrination, finally, on the 1st of June 1966, the People's Daily says, "Sweep away all monsters and demons," when the opening shot of the Cultural Revolution is fired, many of these students are ready to hit out. They've been schooled in class hatred. They start scrutinizing the backgrounds of their teachers. This happens in secondary schools, high schools, universities. This happens over the summer of 1966, but if you go too far, they criticize leading party members. Deng Xiaoping, Liu Shaoqi punish these students. In the absence of Mao, who is touring the south of the country. In mid-July, Mao returns to Beijing. Instead of supporting his 2 colleagues, he turns against them, accusing them of suppressing the student movement and establishing a dictatorship. Mao says, to rebel is justified. Bombard the headquarters. Criticize anyone in any position of power. And the students do it. They start donning loose military uniforms. They call themselves Red Guards. They declare war on the old world. They are there to carry out the Cultural Revolution. They fan out through cities. They confiscate books from libraries and burn them. They tear down temples. They vandalize cathedrals. They change street signs, shop names, anything that smacks of the world before revolution. But of course, there is a small problem here, in that the chairman, Mao, wanted these Red Guards to attack people in the higher echelons of power. But leading party members, the mayor of Shanghai, the mayor of Nanjing, have honed their survival skills over decades of political infighting. They're not about to be outflanked by a bunch of screaming, self-righteous teenagers. They deflect the violence away, encourage the Red Guards to attack ordinary people suspected of being class enemies. Sometimes these leaders create their own Red Guards. And then the Red Guards themselves are divided over who the true enemies of the revolution really are. So they start fighting each other. In the autumn of 1966, the chaos is such that Mao appeals to the population at large to join the Cultural Revolution. It's a social explosion on an unprecedented scale. There's no lack of people who want to say something about local party cadres. All those who had to go through the years of famine with the Great Leap Forward, workers in cities who can barely feed their families, people who have become victims of purges carried on under Liu Shaoqi at the height of the socialist education campaign. But of course, Mao hopes that these proletarian forces will sweep away all counter-revolutionary forces, but they too become divided. They fight each other. Again, the country sinks into chaos, until Mao orders the army in January 1967 to intervene and support the so-called proletarian left. The army is just as bemused as anybody else. Some officers support certain factions, others arm their opponents. Before you know it, this country slides into civil war. People fight each other in the name of Mao with anti-artillery aircraft and machine guns. All of them convinced that they know what it is that Mao has in mind. These are the Red Years. They come to an end in the summer of 1968, when so-called Revolutionary Party committees are established at pretty much any level. They are heavily dominated by the army. Soldiers fan out and oversee factories, schools, offices. They turn this country into a garrison state. I call this the Black Years. It's all top down. The very first thing the army does is send literally millions of young people to the countryside, including all of those who took the chairman at his word in the summer of 1966. Then follows a brutal campaign against people with alleged enemy links, as committees are set up to examine any link with anything foreign among ordinary people and party members alike. In Shanghai alone, over 5,000 people are pretty much hounded to their deaths. Over 170,000 implicated in some sort of kangaroo trial set up by these Revolutionary Party committees. One estimate puts the death count for Guangdong at 40,000. It's a nationwide witch hunt. Playing piano is enough to be sent off to the countryside. This is followed by a campaign against corruption. This is the point where if you poke a hole into a Mao poster, or you buy an egg from the black market, you potentially commit a counter-revolutionary crime. The population is cowed into submission. But of course, as the army acquires clout, Chairman Mao becomes suspicious. In September 1971, Lin Biao, the man who had done so much to promote the cult of Mao Zedong thought, the one who was behind the army, dies in a mysterious plane crash. The army now falls victim to the Cultural Revolution itself. It is purged. The soldiers return to their barracks. It's the end of what I refer to as the Black Years. It's the start of something else. From 1971 to 76, we have a decade I refer to as the Gray Years. It's not red, it's not black, it's not white, it's something rather vague. And it is, in a nutshell, an attempt by ordinary people in the countryside to undermine the command economy, to reclaim very basic economic freedoms. Once the army is purged in 1971 and 72, ordinary people in the countryside realize that while the credibility of the Communist Party has been badly damaged during the Great Leap Forward from 58 to 62, its very organization is in tatters as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Virtually every cadre at some point has been criticized. In this game of cat and mouse, ordinary villagers see an opportunity to very quietly reclaim basic freedoms. That land that belongs to the collectives is taken back. The tools are redistributed. The collective economy, in many cases, vanishes. Black markets are opened by farmers where they can sell the produce that they think will work best. In some parts, and not necessarily the richest ones in the country, but even in poor provinces, farmers open underground factories. There are places like Chuansha, just outside Shanghai, where even before the chairman dies in 1976, the proportion of industrial output reaches some 75%, enormous rate of growth. In a place that is mandated by the state to produce cotton, nobody produces cotton. These underground factories churn out products that are sold on the black market. Local cadres use that money to buy cotton or grain from the black market in order to fulfill their quotas. I call it a silent revolution, done very surreptitiously. And the tens of millions, these farmers go back to what they knew best before 1949. They cultivate their own plot. There's corruption from below that goes all the way up. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping demands that these villagers return to the collectives. It's too little, too late. There's nothing he can do about it. He's a smart man. He allows them to hang on to their economic freedoms. Gives himself the title of architect of economic reforms. The People's Communes disappear 1982, 1983. That's the end of the collectivized economy. But of course, the party now lives in fear of its own people. Limited economic freedoms, yes. Political freedoms, no. That economy that revives, produces wealth that the party uses to rebuild itself. In 1989, Deng Xiaoping sends in tanks to suppress pro-democracy demonstrators on Tiananmen Square. The massacre that follows is a brutal display of sheer willpower. And it sends a signal that pulsates to this very day. That message is, don't ever query the monopoly of the one-party state. Thank you.
China expert Frank Dikötter at the Brisbane Writers' Festival. After his brief overview, he analysed the impact of the Cultural Revolution with RN's Anthony Fennell, who himself has a keen interest in modern China's political history.
On RN, you're listening to Big Ideas with Paul Barclay.
Frank Dikötter, much of your book is based on information that you gathered from various Chinese archives. How did you actually get that kind of access, and why were you given that kind of access?
Well, it's quite simple. You just turn up. Where are my colleagues doing the history of modern China? How come they didn't turn up in the archives? You need an official letter of recommendation. You present it. In some cases, the answer will be no. In other cases, it will be yes. But in every archive I visited, there are always local historians, including students, beavering away and working on the history of the entire Maoist era. They're quite courageous. Now, of course, it has changed, but the entire first decade of the 21st century, all the way up, I would say, till about 2012, was a fantastic era to try and get some very basic information about what happened. I mean, going to archives is like traveling through time. Now, of course, some of these archives were not open at all. They've never really opened up. But there are literally thousands of archives. Every county, of which are more than 2,000, has an archive. Every province, of which there are more than 20, has one. So if you're unlucky in one place, you go to another.
The information that was contained in these archives, who gathered this information and for what purpose?
It's a one-party state. which is obsessed with information on the one hand and secrecy on the other. Like all one-party states, the party wants to know everything about everybody's business. There are notes about the most banal things. If a farmer wishes to take a cow that belongs to the collective to a market, he needs a note. That note needs to be copied. At every level, there's a profusion of paper. And of course, then there is the obsession with secrecy. Sometimes I get asked whether this information might not be destroyed, since frequently it is so compromising. But important documents get copied and sent to very different institutions. I remember one document I discovered in Gansu province. It was quite extraordinary. I arrived, the lady in charge was very welcoming. She said, here are the computers, you read whatever you want. This was the summer of 2007. And she proudly said, we've digitalized everything, so you can search anything you wish. Well, I spent a couple of days reading about all aspects of the Great Leap Forward till I mustered enough courage to tick in rent, cannibalism. Of course, I'm very afraid somebody might look over my shoulder and read with me what's on that screen. There's a whole list of documents appeared. One of them I clicked. It was an investigation by the Public Security Bureau of cases of cannibalism in one single village. There are more than 50 cases listed. The victim, was it a body that had been unearthed? Was it somebody who had been killed? The perpetrators, was it a family? What were the names of these people? What happened to the body? What's the address of these people? All of it was listed. Now you can imagine how important such a document would be, because until now all we've heard is just rumors about cannibalism. How do you pin that down? How do you come up with some incontrovertible evidence? So these kind of documents are enormously important to highlight what happened. I should say in this particular case, I went back to the same archive a year later. Every computer was sealed.
Right.
They'd gone too far. They clearly had gone too far. They didn't think there would be anything important in all that old paperwork.
And you said the change really started around 2012, and of course that's when the current president took over,
Yes.
Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Who, unlike his predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, has in a sense, to a limited extent, embraced some of the symbolism of Mao and Maoism, hasn't he?
Yes. Well, one thing Mr. Xi made very clear in 2012 is that any attempt to look critically at any one episode of the history of the Communist Party of China is tantamount to historical nihilism. Now, I don't really know what that means, but it sounds very intimidating. And it's clearly a term that has done the job rather well, because since 2012, the number of historians inside the People's Republic who work on the post-1949 era has dwindled. I recently spoke to a historian, and I won't say where he came from. He told me that a very respected, highly regarded historian who had already retired was approached by the Public Security Bureau and told not to publish anything on the Mao era, or they would take away his pension and social security. And just to make sure that he understood, the agent of the Public Security Bureau said, this is not just you, it's your entire family as well. It somehow throws a chill on the whole business of investigating the past.
As you mentioned in your presentation, there was, by the end of the Cultural Revolution, in that period you call the grey years, there was a kickback from the population, particularly in rural areas. Your book is very much, isn't it? It's an account of the tremendous suffering and forced conformity throughout the country, but it is also a very optimistic tale in that sense of survival and people fighting in a personal way, or even in a village or town or city way, for the rights they feel that have been taken away from them.
Very much so. And I think this is particularly true for the countryside, where, of course, people have become disillusioned with whatever message the Communist Party may have had already by the middle of the 1950s with collectivization, not to mention the horror of having to go through the famine from 1958 to 62. Already during Mao's Great Leap Forward, there was an attempt by ordinary villagers to at least reclaim some basic freedom that would help them to survive. Cultivate the land themselves or sell some of the produce on black markets. And one of the few things that the Cultural Revolution accomplished, of course from my point of view, is that it shattered the very ranks of the party. In other words, village leaders, local cadres, are fed up themselves with decades of campaigns about re-education and corruption. So ordinary people really seize this opportunity to claim back these very fundamental economic freedoms. You have to understand what a planned economy is. A planned economy is some man somewhere in Beijing who gives orders to the province, which gives orders to the county, which gives orders to a village to say, you will plant cotton on this soil. And will local farmers say, well, we've tried that for decades, but cotton won't grow on this soil. We're better off growing watermelons in sandy soil and sending it to the market. Well, that would be a sign of capitalism. But once the Cultural Revolution damages the clout that the party has, of course, these farmers quietly go back to planting watermelons if they think that is what works best. So, to some extent, what we see here is quite extraordinary, namely one of the strongest, largest planned economies being literally undermined from below by ordinary people, millions upon millions upon millions.
You estimate, I think, around about 2 million people died during the Cultural Revolution, or as a result of the Cultural Revolution, but that came on top of the chaos, the famine caused by Mao with his Great Leap Forward. So roughly between the period of liberation, as it's called, in 1949 and 1976, the end of the Cultural Revolution, what's the estimate for the number of people who died?
Well, some of my critics say that my figures are too high. But as you can tell, 2 million for an entire decade is actually rather low. As I say in my book on the tragedy of liberation, from October 1950 to October 1951, there's one single campaign to eliminate enemies of the regime that results in the execution, shooting, frequently public, of about 2 million people, which is comparable to the totality of those who were hounded to their deaths or died otherwise from 1966 to 76. If you add on the extraordinary catastrophe, the crimes against humanity committed during Mao's Great Famine, where we're talking about tens of millions, I think the best way of putting it would be to say that at least 50 million people under the Mao regime lost their lives unnecessarily. But just to add one thing, the Cultural Revolution isn't about death, really. That happened earlier on in the countryside during the Great Leap Forward, in the cities during the early years of the regime. The Cultural Revolution is about loss. It's about loss of faith in human relationships. It's about loss of trust in other human beings. It's about being compelled, anybody at any level, to somehow denounce a family member, a neighbor, a friend, a colleague. It's a trauma in that sense.
That loss of faith that you talk about, there's a lovely quote in the book from Zhou Enlai, where he is talking about what you described as the silent revolution, as the people giving away the communal life and going back to market capitalism. And Zhou Enlai said, and this is the quote, "Peasants will always be peasants. Every time the situation improves a little, they move back toward capitalism." So this is the base of the party, but even there, this is, I think, 1969 or so,
Yep.
They still had no trust in the people.
No, I mean, it's an extraordinary statement to make. Only Zhou Enlai could make that statement, besides, of course, number two and the chairman himself, to say that the peasants are fundamentally against a socialist economy would get anybody in trouble, straight up to the northern wilderness, go and break stones for 10 years. For Zhou Enlai to say that is quite extraordinary. But of course he understands it very, very well. Without coercion, without constant violence, you cannot maintain a grip on these farmers who basically want to get on with their own lives in ways that they see fit.
It was a turbulent time of constant upheaval, as you make clear in the book. You describe Mao as the Lord of Chaos. Did he have any kind of grand or overarching plan? Or was it really just base instinct from one situation to the next?
There are two mistakes that one can make. One is to underestimate a successful dictator. Hitler, of course, was considered to be a buffoon by many, but he went quite far. Stalin was portrayed as a sort of Georgian barbarian by his enemies, but he went quite far. Mao was seen as some sort of innumerate man, but he went quite far too. So these are extraordinarily wily characters, great actors, choreographers, gifted at corridor politics. But on the other hand, I think it's also a mistake to take on board the cult of personality and see these people as great geniuses who have wonderful plans that are executed to perfection. They improvise, they go along, they make massive mistakes. Hitler, invasion of Poland, that's pretty much the end of the whole story. Stalin, not having thought that the Nazis would invade, goes into hiding for a couple of weeks, doesn't know what to do. Great leap forward under Mao. Thinks there's going to be a leap into utopia, results in the deaths of tens of millions of people. Surely he didn't want that at all. But with the Cultural Revolution, it doesn't really matter. Every act, every statement he makes has unintended consequences. The Red Guards were supposed to take out enemies of the revolution. They start fighting each other instead. But it doesn't really matter. He can improvise. He can go along. He doesn't have to be in control. He has to be in charge. He's the one who can change the rules of the game at any one point. He can rescue a loyal follower. He can throw a close colleague to the dogs. He can proclaim one faction in one province represented by tens of thousands of individuals as counter-revolutionary and change his mind 2 months later, meaning that everybody is constantly trying to prove their absolute loyalty to the chairman. He feeds a cycle of violence, and all of it is very much improvised.
And there are many players who are happy and willing to go along with this. One of the interesting things I think about your history is that it's impossible, I think, not to reconsider the accepted way in which somebody like Zhou Enlai, the eternal number 3, the way in which he is often portrayed as a kind of a break, I guess, on Mao's excesses. And Liu Shaoqi, again, who was the number 2, who is often seen and portrayed as a victim of the Cultural Revolution, a nice old man who became a victim of it.
Indeed.
They're very brutal and vicious players, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Throughout this?
When Liu Shaoqi becomes number 2, he takes control over that socialist education campaign I mentioned from 1962 to 65. He is the one to declare that 1/3 of the countryside is in the hands of class enemies, and he does not hesitate to punish some 5 million people. He and Deng Xiaoping, in the summer of 1966, are very much behind extraordinarily lengthy inquisitions against some of their very own colleagues. One of them jumps through a window, breaks his leg. They mock him. They say he couldn't even jump properly.
Some of these were colleagues that they had struggled with, they'd been on the Long March with as well. So they were people they'd spent a long personal time getting to know.
Of course, there are factions. Of course, there are the people who go back for decades. But the willingness of many of them at the very top to somehow go along in order to preserve their own position is quite extraordinary. And not just in a passive manner. I think at every level, they use the Cultural Revolution to settle their own accounts, to get rid of their own enemies. And there can't be a better example than Zhou Enlai, the man who's so often portrayed as, the premier, who's the diplomatic face of the People's Republic of China, and did so much to prevent some of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, the man who stepped in to save some of these scholars and intellectuals. It is Zhou Enlai who was the prime mover behind the campaigns during what I refer to as the Black Years in 1969 and 70, some extraordinarily brutal purges and investigations of people running into literally the tens of thousands. So he's not just a passive figure. When he sees an opportunity, he's in there.
You believe also, don't you, that Zhou Enlai knew that there should be a limit to his ambition, that it was good to be number 3 in the party structure. It was not a good idea to try and be number 2.
No. So this, to me, is the great mystery. It became very evident to Zhou Enlai already in the 1930s that you shouldn't really get on the wrong side of Mao Zedong. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And most of all, you don't want to get too close to the tiger. Being a number 2 is a bad idea. You will get purged at one point or another. And so he did his very best to portray himself as the faithful servant who had no ambition, who was always happy to be the number 3. Mao didn't really buy it. An extraordinarily perceptive man who could very much see straight through individuals, didn't buy it, criticized him at the end of his life for being a complete hypocrite. But nonetheless, he managed to survive. Lin Biao, on the other hand, the one who stood behind the army, was more or less forced to assume the position of number 2. And he didn't like it. And I think to some extent, he knew at the end of his life, round about a month before his death in September 71, he knew what would happen. He knew it would end rather badly. And of course it did, with that plane crash in Mongolia that still remains a bit of a mystery.
Now, Lin Biao dies. Mao understands or believes or is convinced that Lin Biao has tried to flee the country because he's about to attempt a coup and force Mao out. From your book, I got the feeling that after that incident with Lin Biao, that Mao really kind of lost a taste for the Cultural Revolution, that he wasn't so involved in the machinations as he was perhaps before 71. Would that be right?
Yes, I think so. If you read the wonderful memoir of his doctor, Li Zhisui, it's an extraordinary book, not just in the annals of Chinese history. If you want to read any memoir about any one dictator of the 20th century, Li Zhisui is about as good as you can get. It's an extraordinary book, highly recommend it. And he, of course, is very close to the chairman, being his doctor. And the moment Lin Biao dies, he notices that the chairman becomes depressed for months on end, When Kissinger, Nixon arrive, 72, they really have to prop him up. And he gets better. The one who walks around with a big smile after the death of Lin Biao is Zhou Enlai. He says, oh, that's probably the very best solution we could dream of. Of course, with Lin Biao out of the way, Zhou Enlai acquires more clout without having to become number 2.
I want to return to the ordinary people of China during this period of time. A lot of really terrible things happened to ordinary people, but they were also forced to do really terrible things to each other, weren't they?
Yeah. But on the other hand, what I thought was so amazing from the archives, of course we know about the denunciations, about families that are split in more than one way. You know, there's an era of chaos that has traumatized so many individuals, but what is so evident from the archives is the extent to which very ordinary people, in particular in the countryside, but also in cities, develop all sorts of coping mechanisms. They pretend. I have to denounce you, you know what will happen. I will stand up, denounce you, you will look humbled, and in the evening we'll get together and have a talk. Religion is crushed, but it goes underground. People manage to survive with black markets before they become more common from 71 onwards. Culture, quite literally, is the object of attack of the Cultural Revolution. But culture retreats into the homes and houses of ordinary people. We talk about a revival of religion in the People's Republic of China, but it's never really disappeared. So in that sense, too, I think the Cultural Revolution was a great failure. The extraordinary ingenuity of ordinary people, the ways they managed to somehow get around all of this chaos, I think comes out very clearly from the archives, very clearly.
As you said earlier too, there was constant change in the sense that people who were in favour or factions who were in favour were suddenly out of favour overnight at Mao's whim. And, you know, this happened for Red Guards, it happened for the army, it happened for universities. So there was a constant unpredictability, which must have weighed enormously on people.
Yes, of course, one might try to stay out of politics. And you can see this already in 1967 among some Red Guards. Not all students are Red Guards. Many students are not even allowed to be Red Guards because they come from what is seen to be a questionable class background. But some of the pure Red Guards become disillusioned already in 1967 and become part of what they call the free and unfettered. Since schools are closed, they stay home. They read the books they were supposed to have burned, but of course stole from the library. Or they manage to find a way into the library and read books, copy them by hand, listen to records, to some extent acquire even more freedoms than they had before the start of the Cultural Revolution. This is 1967. You could go further and say that by the time that Lin Biao dies, Lin Biao, the man who was supposed to be the most faithful follower of the chairman, when he dies in September 71, in some parts of the country, people listen to foreign radio. And when they hear this, there's several testimonies about it, when they hear it, they lose their faith, not just in the party itself, but Mao. I think it's simply not possible. All of this doesn't really amount to anything believable. I think that really is a crucial moment, 71.
The Cultural Revolution famously did enormous damage to the historic and cultural fabric of the country, but it also was ruinous on the environment, wasn't it? I mean, tell us about the campaign to learn from Dazai, or Dazai.
Oh, that's probably one of the most overlooked episodes of the Cultural Revolution, in that most historians, political scientists have really focused on the so-called red years, 66, 67 Red Guards. But during the black years, 68, 71, when the army takes control, I think you have, in a nutshell, almost a return to that radical collectivization of the Great Leap Forward. But this time, the army is in charge. So Dazai is supposed to be a model village somewhere in the midst of sheer poverty, where the head of the village, by collectivizing everything, has been able to pull his villagers out of poverty without any assistance from the state. And this becomes the model to be followed. This being a village in the middle of the mountains in Shanxi province, he terraced some of the mountains in order to produce more grain. So all over the country, people start terracing everything they can find. They even build mountains artificially in order to create terraces. It's madness, absolute madness. The number of lakes that are being drained, the damage to the environment is extraordinary, but again, so similar to the Great Leap Forward, which is of course the greatest attack on nature since 1949, was Mao's Great Famine, the Great Leap Forward, massive attack on nature. Within some parts of the country, up to half of the forest that disappeared. So again with Dazai, 68, 69, 70, 71, again, massive assault on nature. Nature is seen as an enemy.
And throughout this time as well, there's also what's called the Third Front going on, which was another massive reorganisation of the country, wasn't it? Based on paranoia about the country's security and its industry. Just briefly tell us about that.
I think that Mao believed that Stalin had a number of shortcomings. I told you about one of them. He failed to spot Khrushchev as his potential enemy. But another mistake Stalin made, in Mao's view, I think, is to not predict the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany. So what Mao does is literally relocate thousands of factories along the coast, Beijing, Tianjin, all the way to Shanghai, Guangzhou, and rebuild them in the middle of nowhere in the hinterland. That's supposed to be the Third Front. So that if either the Americans or the Soviets attack, at least some of the industry in the middle of nowhere, in Anhui province, in Sichuan, in Guizhou, will be preserved. It is probably, as I said, thousands of factories are dismantled, relocated. Hundreds of thousands of workers have to live, in some cases, in caves. It is probably the single one most important example of a misallocation of resources in the 20th century. Most of the industrial investment during the Cultural Revolution was the Third Front, and it was an utter waste. It's an utter waste.
And it went on after the end of the Cultural Revolution, didn't it? 1980 it finishes, roughly around about there.
Yes, it started a few years earlier. It goes on beyond that. There's very little to show for it. It's very difficult to think of an industrial project that would be more wasteful than the so-called Third Front.
The legacy of the Cultural Revolution, how it's seen today, or how it's remembered, what it means for people in China, ordinary people in China, and also for the leadership of China today. Let's start with the ordinary people.
It's very difficult to say. And it's not like you can go around and ask people what they think about the Cultural Revolution. You'll get a standard answer. I think that it's very clear that for decades, the Cultural Revolution was viewed by ordinary people as an absolute disaster. But what is so, I think, upsetting for many is that over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it has become very, very difficult for professional historians to do anything on that decade. There were 1 or 2 museums set up by wealthy entrepreneurs on the Cultural Revolution. These museums have closed down. There used to be websites where you could read the memoirs of victims of the Cultural Revolution. These websites have been closed down. So it is as if there is a narrowing of that very little space of freedom and memory that ordinary people had for decades after the death of Chairman Mao. I tell an extraordinary story. I was in Melbourne. A young lady came up to me, said, "I'd like to speak to my parents about the Cultural Revolution." They came from China, said they won't speak to me about it. And my grandmother says, "What if the neighbors overhear us? What would happen?" I think the idea that someone who has spent decades in this country still somehow believes that there might be a neighbor overhearing what you have to say about the Cultural Revolution, surely that's a very clear indication of trauma, if not fear.
And just very briefly, Xi Jinping, the president of China, who occasionally likes to wear a Sun Yat-sen suit and look like Mao, what would he think of the Cultural Revolution? What for him, looking back on that period of history, and his family were badly affected by it, what do you think he has learnt from that part of his history?
I think that when we talk about Xi Jinping or his enemy who was put on trial, Bo Xilai, we think of different factions within the Communist Party of China. But I can assure you they are all united on their condemnation of the Cultural Revolution. From the point of view of a party member, what happened in 1966 and 67 is that Mao allowed ordinary people to criticize members of the Communist Party of China. And that was a major mistake. In other words, there is a very common view that democracy is precisely what happened in 66, 67. It's chaos. It's allowing ordinary people to criticize the party. And you should never, ever repeat that mistake. Hence that determination to keep a firm grip on politics.
And that's unfortunately where we'll have to leave this discussion. Please join me in giving Frank a round of applause.
Anthony Fennell, presenter of Future Tense on RN, in conversation with Frank Dikötter, Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. Thanks for listening to This Big Ideas. Until next time, from me, Paul Barclay, bye for now. If you've enjoyed This Big Ideas, you'll find more great discussions from Australia and around the world at abc.net.au/rn/bigideas.